Hello everyone, happy Friday. I hope you've been having a good week. Here in Texas we're having a beautiful early spring and everything is in bloom much earlier than normal. Which is sort of odd because the spring holy days are much later this year. We had a lot of rain this winter and just a couple of light freezes, and I'm sure that may have been a contributing factor to the early show of flowers here. Parts of East Texas and Louisiana have experienced some pretty bad flooding in the past weeks, but hopefully things are getting back to normal there. But wherever you may be tonight, we hope all is well. Last week we finished reading chapter 4, but there are probably a few things we need to review or capitalize on. So make sure you have your favorite Bible and notepad, and let's get started. Chapter 4 is about opposition and how to deal with it. It seems like when you've got an important job to do, something will inevitably come up to make the job even more difficult. Don't you find that to be the case? And the more important the job, the bigger the obstacle, right? Why is it when you're in the middle of what might be a mission from God, the adversary pops up out of the blue and turns your job into a seemingly impossible mission? Well, that's a rhetorical question, of course, and we all know why the adversary shows up, don't we? That's what happened to the people building the wall and the gates. Sanballat and Tobiah and the rest of the gang were adamant about this wall being rebuilt. They didn't want Jerusalem to be a viable city whose walls were impenetrable. Maybe they were afraid Jerusalem was going to interrupt their revenue stream along this lucrative trade route. Like I mentioned last week, Nehemiah's rebuilding project was threatening their positions of power and influence in what was their political domain. These were their stomping grounds, and they didn't want invaders coming in unless they were willing to play by the established rules. These guys were bullies, and they were the bullies who were in charge, and everyone was expected to play by their rules or else. Whatever their motives and whatever their reasons, they were going to do everything in their power to make sure this project was not going to continue. The people working on the wall might have begun to think it wasn't even going to be possible to finish the wall. But Nehemiah was a man of God, and he was a resourceful leader, and he wasn't going to be intimidated by these thugs. Sanballat and his gang might have seemed like an unstoppable force, but they were up against the quintessential, immovable object, which was Nehemiah, the wall builders, and, more importantly, the Almighty God of Israel. There's good commentary at Bible.org about this opposition the wall builders were up against, and here are a couple of paragraphs. Quote, when Igor Sikorsky was 12 years old, his parents told him that competent authorities had already proved human flight impossible. He went on to build the first helicopter. In his American plant, he posted this sign: according to recognized aerotechnical tests, the bumblebee cannot fly because of the shape and weight of its body in relationship to the total wing area. The bumblebee does not know this, so he goes ahead and flies anyway. End of that quote. Nehemiah would have loved that sign. His story shows that whenever you try to accomplish anything significant for the Lord, you will face strong opposition. Satan never bothers with half-hearted people who are content with a ho-hum spiritual existence. But if you come on fire for Christ, look out. The name Satan means adversary. He is committed to opposing God and his people, especially when they are zealous to exalt God's glory. Still quoting, this is true on the personal level. As long as you live with one foot in the world, living according to the world's values and for the world's goals, Satan won't trouble you. You can go to church and even pray and read your Bible, and he won't mind. But the minute you wake up from your spiritual lethargy, Shake off the worldly mindset and commit yourself to radical obedience to Jesus Christ. You will encounter spiritual opposition." End quote. Now, regarding Nehemiah, one thing we know for sure is that he didn't suffer from spiritual lethargy, and he knew exactly how to deal with opposition. We too need to be able to properly deal with opposition, whether it has its roots with other people or whether it stems from our adversary, the devil. According to Stephen Cole of Bible.org, Nehemiah 4 teaches us that when the enemy opposes us, as he surely will, we should respond with prayer, work, vigilance, and focus on the Lord. I would add fasting to that list. Fasting in conjunction with prayer draws us closer to God, and we see throughout the Bible how effective that combination is. You'll recall that Nehemiah fasted in preparation for this project, as we read in the 4th verse of chapter 1. One of the reasons Nehemiah's story is so relevant for us here in the 21st century is the fact that what we're seeing and reading about is the spiritual war that's being waged against Nehemiah and his people. And we're seeing how an effective spiritual leader fights back and wins in a spiritual conflict. We need examples like Nehemiah, because the spiritual war that rages around us is every bit as threatening and dangerous as the war the wall builders are experiencing. The book of Nehemiah could be divided up into 3 different sections, and the first section would be chapters 1 through 7, and these chapters cover the events relating to the building of the wall. To me, chapters 4 and 6 are the bellwether chapters for Nehemiah. In chapter 4, his leadership skills really shine, as they do in chapter 6, which we'll soon see. We see his organizational skills. He motivates the wall builders and places them to do what they need to do and where they'll be the most effective. He cries out to God for protection, and he asks that God will personally deal with the enemies. And of course, he's courageous. This was a time that called for a truly courageous leader. He marshaled the people like a commanding officer would rally his troops before going to battle. Well, he was their commanding officer, but his call to arms speech was very brief as he recorded it in his journal. But his encouragement to them was surely a more lengthy and intensive speech that inspired everyone to defend themselves if necessary. And it was necessary for them to be ready because they faced a real threat. We've all seen movies that feature really inspiring speeches by generals or kings that were given to fire up the troops. General George Patton comes to mind when he would motivate his troops before going to battle. If anyone was a motivational general, it was Patton, right? Well, another great military motivator was Henry V. The speech he made to his army on the eve of St. Crispin's Day was electrifying, inspirational to say the least. The English army was far outnumbered by their opponents, something like 15-1. These men faced certain death. They were downcast and dispirited, as you might guess. But Henry turned them around in about 5 minutes. His speech motivated them all right. His exhilarating call to arms turned his cowering infantry into a determined, invincible force that eagerly anticipated taking on the enemy. Do yourself a favor and watch it sometime on YouTube. You won't be sorry. It's an inspiring 5 or 6 minute scene. Just Google Henry V's speech on the eve of St. Crispin's Day. Now that's what I imagine Nehemiah's speech may have been like when they were themselves may have been on the eve of battle, feeling a little weak and powerless. Nehemiah was amazing, but he was a humble man, and he probably understated everything that otherwise may have glorified or magnified him. Okay, let's move on to chapter 5. This chapter doesn't quite have the excitement quotient that chapters 4 and 6 have, but it's here for a reason. So what's going on in chapter 5? At this point, the wall isn't completed, and apparently the reconstruction came to a halt because many of the people were having a terrible time making ends meet. And this was causing serious strife among the people. Well, up to now, the outsiders weren't able to shut the project down, but the internal strife among the people did cause the project to stop. And one might draw an analogy to what's happening in our own country. Internal strife in a family, church, or any kind of organization can often do more harm than some threatening external force, and the internal strife in our country appears to be getting worse by the day. As far back as Abe Lincoln, when he was presiding over our divided country during the Civil War, he recognized the fact that if America was going to be defeated, it would be defeated from within, and not because of some outside force. In Judah at this time, there were 3 things that contributed to the financial problems, and they're mentioned in verses 2 through 5. So let's start reading chapter 5. Verse 1. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during this famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." So they're in a famine, and they're not making much money off of their crops. But they still have to buy food and pay taxes, and they're having to mortgage property in order to pay their bills. When they can't pay their bills, they're forced to sell their children into slavery or servitude. That's what they did back then. And sadly, those who did have money to lend were charging interest to their own Jewish brothers and sisters, and that was forbidden by God. Here's what they must have known. Deuteronomy 23:19 and 20 states this: "Do not charge a fellow Israelite interest, or usury, whether on money, or food, or anything else that may earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but not a fellow Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to in the land you are entering to possess." Like so many other of God's laws, this was one of those things that produced blessings if you obeyed them, or just the opposite if you didn't. And at this point, they weren't being blessed. Verse 6. "When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, 'You're charging your own people interest.' So I called together a large meeting to deal with them." Verse 8, "And I said, 'As far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us.' They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, 'What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let us stop charging interest.'" Now, I'm sure Nehemiah and his brothers weren't charging interest. He's just including themselves in the larger group of making those loans. Verse 11, "Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil." These 5 verses show that Nehemiah thought through the problem and was not the least bit intimidated to face the problem head on. It was the nobles and high-ranking officials who were taking advantage of the poor people, if you can imagine that. And he demanded they stop it immediately. I think it's interesting what he says in verse 9. He says this, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies?" Here again, he seems to be sticking up for God. He wants to avoid anything that could be a disgrace to Jerusalem. This was God's city, after all, and he didn't want anything going on that would sully God's name. Now, before going on to verse 12, let's take a short break.
Asking yourself, what would Jesus do, may not be the right question. It may be more important to ask, what does Jesus tell us to do? You can be sure of that. For a free introductory CD titled The Words of Jesus, write to Born to Win, Post Office Box 560, White House, Texas 75791, or call toll-free 1-888-BIBLE-44.
Verse 12. "We will give it back," they said, "and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, "In this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied." At this, the whole assembly said, "Amen," and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. Nehemiah handled this problem swiftly and handily, and those he confronted reacted honorably and quickly. The problem was solved, and lives could be normalized once again, and rebuilding the wall could resume. Still, life was difficult for many of the people. The remaining verses of this chapter show how Nehemiah further helped the people by not taxing them to pay for his gubernatorial expenses, as previous governors had done. Verse 14. "Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be the governor of the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them, in addition to the food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people, but out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work, and we did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people." So that's the end of chapter 5. All is well that ends well, and chapter 5 has a good ending. It could have gotten ugly. It could have caused a greater divide among the people, but with the help of a wise, resolute leader, the problem was heard and addressed and resolved in short order. Those who were in the wrong readily agreed to change and do what was right. Nehemiah made conflict resolution look easy. So now we move on to chapter 6. We don't know how much time transpired in the course of chapter 5, but I doubt that it was more than a few days. So the work resumed, and when we get to verse 1 of chapter 6, the wall has been rebuilt, but the doors haven't yet been set. Verse 1. When the word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors and the gates. Verse 2, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message. Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me. Ono was about 20 to 25 miles northwest of Jerusalem, just a couple of miles from where Tel Aviv is today, and this was on the border of Benjamin and Samaria. It would have been about a day's journey to get there and another day coming back. Verse 3. So I sent messengers to them with this reply, I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave and go down to you? Nehemiah discerned their desperation and deceitfulness. He knew that they were up to no good and only meant to do him harm. And really, he wouldn't have even needed to answer them because essentially it was all over for his detractors. The battle was over. Nehemiah's work was nearly completed. But he formally answered them that his work was far too important and there was no way he was going to meet with them. It would have been disastrous for the city if he would have left during this critical time. Verse 4. 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. Then, the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand an unsealed letter, in which was written, It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together. So when their deceitful ploy to get Nehemiah to meet with them on their own turf failed, they resorted to blackmail. They invented a fictitious scenario and threatened to inform the king of his supposed insurrection. And if he still refused to meet with them, they would run to the king with this fabricated story. He had to respond. Silence might have looked like there was some truth to their story. Verse 8. I sent him this reply. Nothing like that you are saying is happening. You're just making it up out of your head. Verse 9. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and will not be complicated. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in at his house. He said, Let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you. But I said, Should a man like me run away, or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Verse 13, He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. The Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary has this to say about Shemaiah and Nehemiah. Quote, This man was the son of a priest who was an intimate and confidential friend of Nehemiah. The young man claimed to be endowed with the gift of prophecy. Having been secretly bribed by Sanballat, he, in his pretended capacity of prophet, told Nehemiah that his enemies were that night to make an attempt upon his life. He advised him at the same time to consult his safety by concealing himself in the sanctuary, a crypt which from its sanctuary was strong and secure. But the noble-minded governor determined at all hazards to remain at his post and not bring discredit on the cause of God and religion by his unworthy cowardice in leaving the temple and the city unprotected. This plot, together with a secret collusion between the enemy and the nobles of Judah, who were favorably disposed towards the bad Samaritan in consequence of his Jewish connections, the undaunted courage and vigilance of Nehemiah were enabled, with the blessing of God, to defeat, and the erection of the walls thus built in troublous times was happily completed in the brief space of 52 days. So rapid execution, even supposing some parts of the old wall standing, cannot be sufficiently accounted for except by the consideration that the builders labored with the ardor of religious zeal, as men employed in the work of God." End quote. Then Nehemiah says a short prayer that God would deal with his enemies, on the outside of the walls, as well as those inside Jerusalem, who had been compromised by Sanballat. Verse 14. "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophet Noadiah, and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me." So the wall was completed on the 25th day of Elul, in 52 days. When our enemies heard about all this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they realized that the work had been done with the help of our God. Also in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Verse 19, "Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds, and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me." The last couple of verses here indicate just how bad things can get when people marry the wrong people against God's will. Matthew Henry's concise commentary has this to say about the last two verses, 18 and 19. Quote, "The wall was begun and finished in 52 days, though they rested on the Sabbaths. A great deal of work may be done in a little time if we set about it in earnest and keep close to it. See the mischief of marrying with strangers. When men once became akin to Tobiah, they soon became sworn to him. A sinful love leads to a sinful league. The enemy of souls employs many instruments and forms many projects to bring reproach on the active servants of God, or to take them from their work." End quote. Remember when Ezra arrived in Jerusalem after the temple had been completed? That was in the 7th year of Darius, according to Ezra 7:8. Well, that was about 13 years before Nehemiah's venture into Jerusalem. Nehemiah came in the 20th year of King Darius, you'll recall. Anyway, the problem Ezra encountered was directly related to the problem in these last two verses of Nehemiah 6. Turn back to Ezra 9. Ezra 9, verse 1. "After these things had been done, the leaders came to me and said, 'The people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. They have taken some of the daughters as their wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them, and the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness.' When I heard this, I tore my tunic and cloak, pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat down appalled. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel gathered around me because of this unfaithfulness of the exiles. And I sat there appalled until the evening sacrifice." You can see how serious this sin was. At the time, many may have wondered what the big deal was. But God, in His infinite wisdom, knew what would happen. And we can see what Nehemiah had to put up with 13 years later as a result of intermarriage that was forbidden by God. So that's the end of chapter 6, and next week we'll take up with chapter 7. Chapter 7 marks the completion of the wall, and Nehemiah puts his brother, Hanani, in charge of the city, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because they were men of integrity and they feared God. Nehemiah is making sure all is well and all the right people are in charge in Jerusalem, because he's heading back to the Persian court at this point. But fear not, he'll be returning to Jerusalem very soon. That does it for me tonight, friends. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to email me at richg@borntowin.net, and don't forget to include your whereabouts. That's very important. Now, I might add that there is a great sermon out there that Ron Dart did, and it's titled, My Role Model. Remember that title, My Role Model. And sometime this week, if you get a chance, give it a listen. Go to borntowin.net and just search for that sermon title. It's an excellent sermon about Nehemiah. It doesn't cover all of the chapters, but you'll get a great perspective on how Mr. Dart felt about Nehemiah. It's really a great listen. I recommend that you hear it sometime as soon as possible. But thank you for joining us tonight. I look forward to having you back again next week as we embark on part 6 in this study of the book of Nehemiah. Good night, everyone. See you soon.